Okay, I think we're live. Okay, if somebody can give me a thumbs up or something that you can hear me, just always want to make sure I'm not speaking and shouting into the wind or on mute. All right, so welcome everybody. So listen, don't let the avocado toast fool you, right? Despite what you've heard, Gen Z are more fiscally responsible than we give them credit for. So welcome everybody and happy Women's History Month. I'm Christina Green, generational translator, speaker, and founder of Cardigan Careers. Now, today we're continuing our series for Women's History Month, where each week we've been diving into the women's experiences between across the generations and how they've been contributing to the workforce. And today we are spotlighting Gen Z, women who they get the most crap from the older generations because they are still the entry level positions, they are still the newbies, the rookies coming into the workplace, and that's rubbing a couple people a little wrong. So, let's get into it, right? So, listen, Gen Z are the architects of the future, and you can fight me in the comments if you disagree with me, but I'm going to tell you exactly why they are. I'm going to go through an understanding of what has kind of shaped, their generation and how it is that they actually are contributing to the workforce today. Right? So they are reshaping this future, the future of work and how it's, being thought of and approached but they can't do it by themselves. Just like no generation should be taking this on by themselves. So let's talk a little bit about how it is that we start to bridge this gap. How do we get there? Okay, so right, so the Gen Z they are between 1997 and 2012. This is when they were born. They are about 68 million in size. So this is just a few million shy of millennials, few million shy of boomers as well, and it's just a little bit more than the Gen X. Than Gen X. They are still entering the workforce. They started entering the workforce in about 2015. So, and they will continue to do so with the size of this generation through the year 2030. Now, they are born primarily to Gen X. So, those that are typically the Gen Xers that were born in the 70s. So, excuse me. And so they've raised them with this concept of digital freedom, right? So, and self reliance. Now, maybe not as much as Gen Alpha, which is the generation that follows them, where they're, very tech savvy and 100%, if you will, raised on computers and technology. But this tech savviness has actually we've kind of raised them to be a bit more skeptical and a lot more independent. So, Gen Xers using our own experiences and actually using it to influence the raising of our children, of course, much like boomers did for millennials. They also too are the most diverse and inclusive group of any of the generations so far. And we'll go into what that looks like a bit because they actually from racially, ethnically, gender identity, they are the most diverse and inclusive group of any of the generations. They are digital natives, they can struggle with that one-on-one, that in-person communication. So this is where you'll see where they may not lean in the direction of preferring to jump on a call, be in a meeting, or even accept phone calls, right? And this does not mean that this is not a bad thing about the generation. It's just speaking to how it is that they have been cultivating their adult experience, right? When you think about it, COVID was a good 3, 4 years of most, and many of them actually during high school, right? So they spent a lot of time online, and they're very comfortable being independent and being very resilient in that space. But when it comes to the in-person communication, that may not be their preference. So and I say may not because remember, there are exceptions to every single rule. This is not the playbook for all Gen Z because you can have very outgoing people, part of the generation who love to communicate in person, who love to get together, right? But this is kind of understanding a baseline across the generations. Okay, so excuse me, they may prefer texting. Of course, during when they're communicating within a workspace with their friends group, that may be something different. You may have experienced if I'm a Gen X, I have Gen Z children and adult children who may text each other while they're sitting right next to each other in the back seat as I'm driving, right? This is common. Yes, maybe us Gen Xers may think that this is rude. We were raised differently, right? We were raised in a completely different environment than they were. So I want you to give them a little bit of leeway in understanding why that is a preferred method of communication. Okay. Now, they are also to the most or the least brand loyal generation. And across the board to how it is that they consume products as well as the employment opportunities. They're not necessarily going to be bought into being loyal directly to a particular employer, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit later about these short stints that they may have within the workforce, right? Within their career, you may see that they have large gaps between their employment, and there's a good reason for that. They are the least likely to use email, but they are the most likely to multitask. About 87% of Gen Zers in the workplace will be multitasking. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. They have figured out a way to master this, where my Gen X brain tries to multitask many times through post-it notes and physical notes and online notes and using various apps and all. I will say that I'm nowhere near as good as my Gen Z children at doing this, but they have figured out a way to leverage technology to be able to support the execution of their work. So this is why the approach is to how it is that they are executing on their task is less important than the fact that they are, right? So and they also too have a greater emphasis and greater importance on their mental health, more so than a salary. They would care more about working for and supporting a company's strategic objectives based on if they are supporting their mental health as opposed to a pay raise, right? This does not mean that they don't deserve compensation. What they are speaking to is the fact that it is more important that they protect their peace and their mental sanity because they've watched their Gen X parents burn that candle at both ends and they're not willing to end that race the same place that we are. Okay. All right, now why do I care about this so much? This generational dynamics is the work that I truly love to do. So after about 2 decades in healthcare, I got burnt out with this idea of corporate parenting, right? I'm always being told you got to pay your dues. You have to toughen up, right? You got to have some tough skin around here. Or this is how we've always done it this way, so just deal with it, right? Or you have to put your time in order to climb the corporate ladder, right? Or and all of this just didn't it never rang true for me. It just always rubbed me the wrong way, as I know it has many of you. Right? Now, as a Gen X leader, I've seen and I've heard, you know, the opposite of that, that these younger generations that they're so entitled that they think that everything comes easy to them, or I had to work many years to get here and you think you can just do this overnight. Well, or I hear the other side of that argument is like, listen, I'm so tired of fighting to be heard, right? So I just stopped talking. I just stopped sharing in those meetings. I stopped sharing my ideas because I get shot down all the time. Or also too, like my age has nothing to do with my value. You know, I have value to add to this conversation, but I'm not going to because I keep getting met with resistance. So most people have found a way to kind of navigate through their conscious bias, right? So, having to do with race and gender and age, but most people rarely identify their unconscious bias around generational bias. They don't recognize that this really is actually affinity bias, where you're favoring others who are part of a group that you belong to. They're similar to yourself. They don't hear or understand the words that they're saying and understand how they might be taken. Part of this is and why I call it corporate parenting is because we are applying the way that we were raised and bringing it into the workforce, right? So Gen X, we very much were taught to be seen and not heard. Children should be seen and not heard, right? But we didn't have a voice in that space. How many times do we sit at the kids' table for holidays, for big functions? How many times were the children separated from the parents, right? When we had gatherings, right? So kids were not allowed in what were called more like adult spaces, right? And so there's kind of this understanding that why would we allow a child, right? Even though they are an adult, why would we allow a child to have a voice or opinion in this space about adult things? Well, guess what? As you saw on the prior slides, that their ages right now, yes, Gen Z are anywhere from 13 to 28. So you've got they're 18 plus, they are adults. So it's time we start figuring out how to treat them as such, right? And I know that requires an awful lot of swallowing of our pride to recognize when our children are stepping into the workforce and we're still there. Okay? So, but this is how people start to adopt this corporate parenting mentality and to raise their teams instead of leading them. All right. So, I do this work to raise generational awareness, to help people understand that your generational dynamics are absolutely influencing your success in your organization, on your team, as a leader, even as an individual contributor towards your career advancement opportunities. It really is impacting that at the granular level. I also too I help teams identify these biases. So what does the language sound like, right? Sometimes if you have someone else listening to the words you are saying, you don't recognize your own bias. And this is not to shame anyone because I've done it. We've all done it. This has all been part of our conditioning in this space. But when we take the time to build this bridge to understanding awareness and build the bridge to the future, by recognizing our own biases, this is how we start to create and paint this canvas of the future that actually works for all of us. And yes, there is always an ROI to this, right? Because when you make when your team feels seen, heard, and valued, they're more apt to stay. They're more apt to be engaged, and they're more apt to attract that great talent, right? And if you know anything about your retention numbers, it'll cost you at least 50 to 200% to replace those positions. I don't know anybody who has that money to waste. All right, so now let's start diving into understanding a bit more about Gen Z. Okay, so here is the this is just a glimpse from historically, right? If you've been following my series, you know that we've been looking at each of the generations and the historical climate, right? What has been influencing or actually taking place during the time that they were born and how, when they were entering the workforce. We're doing the same thing with Gen Z. Okay. So Gen Z was born about 1970s or from 1997 to 2012 when they started entering the workforce between 2015 and 2030, right? So they are still coming into the workforce. At the time that they were born, they were barely experiencing, right, some of the issues, right? So 9/11 was happening. I remember my son actually was I think I was newly pregnant with my oldest son as I was watching the towers get struck, as I was watching the news coverage for this. And all of this has an impact on the climate of the country. Now, they may have been children and really kind of babies at the time that this was happening, but think about what that climate looked like, right? What the patriotism looked like, what the retribution, right? Because it then led to Osama bin Laden's capture and ultimately demise, right? We had a great recession, right? Think about the housing boom in 2008. A lot of things were happening, although they may have been too young to understand. This was also too part of the climate, part of the energy, the hum, if you will, on the planet. They also too, as they're moving into as their adolescents, in their adolescence, they're witnessing school shootings that are directly impacting not maybe not their direct community, but they're now starting to go through through drills, right, for school shooting drills. So now their norm is different in this school setting, very different than what it was for, let's say, for their parents, for Gen Xers. I've never been through a school shooting drill, right? How to be prepared if there's an active shooter on campus, but our children have, right? So and they started doing this. I forget when they started it, but they have been experiencing what it is like to kind of experience that fear within what is supposed to be a safe space. All right. They also too have lived in as they were entering the workforce. The 45th president was elected and came with a series of policies and started. The country started to respond to that in great ways. They also too were either in high school and or newly within their careers, experiencing the lockdown of COVID. Right, the pandemic that were shutting down global communities due to the threat of this virus. They also too in the US, they saw the US Capitol, attack and have witnessed how it is that we have and or have not, held people accountable. They also too have witnessed the reversal of Roe v. Wade. So women who had the right to choose before, back in 1974, that now was at the federal level was released to the states to be able to make decisions. There also too have witnessed the Russia invading Ukraine. That is still currently going on. And then climate related disasters that are on the rise, right? The polar caps that have been melting. They've been witnessing all of these things. So they may not have a recollection of all of these great disasters or these milestones throughout our timeline, but they also too they understand what it feels like to have to be in a country that is hurting and how to grow up in that and to also to step into adulthood while experiencing that as well. They are inheriting a damaged planet, and yes, they absolutely care about that. Now, I've had this debate and this conversation with many friends often about why is it that we turn a blind eye to that maybe in some of our older generations, boomers, Gen Xers, we may not be carrying the torch of trying to fight climate change, or global warming. But yet the younger generations they're closer to understanding that this is the planet they're inheriting and they want to do more about it. They care about their carbon footprint. There are active conversations in communities that are constantly diving into these discussions. They care about cattle overproduction, what that does to our planet. They care about the ice melting and at record levels in the Arctic and the Antarctic. They care about where their food is sourced. They care about what they are putting into their bodies. They care about self-governing their own bodies, and they will not be quiet about that. And they care also too about being a mental support for one another. So while we may see parodies about, uh, I'll say, stereotypes about how it is that Gen Z shows up for one another, how they show up for one another in other spaces, and but what I think is very beautiful about this generation is that they are stepping up and they're using their voice. They're using their voice to say, "Listen, we're not gonna tolerate that any longer," right? You gotta remember also too, they have been part of the generation, and millennials have been part of this as well, through cyberbullying, right? We used to think that, well, it's normal to go through high school and to be bullied to some extent, right? The boomers and Gen Xers, we had the various groups within high school, and you think that high school is the way that life is. And it is not until we become adults and we step out of high school that we realize that's not how life is at all. And so to see Gen Z actually show up for one another in a way that is so supportive of being able to reclaim their peace and to step into a space that is not going to allow things to that we normally would have accepted in prior generations. They are now bringing voice to say, "We're gonna halt that. That's not gonna happen," right? So they're using their voice in that space, and I think it's really beautiful. And they're doing this also too in the workplace, and that also too is what's rubbing people the wrong way. Okay. All right, no questions. So I'm going to keep going. So now, but with all of this bad, right? With all of these terrible things going on, if you will, in our timeline, there also too are a series of great things that have been happening within their time, within their generation, within their lifetime. A couple of them I will call out is we had the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, where this is making healthcare affordable and accessible for millions more of Americans than who had access to this before. We also too had the Black Lives Movement, which is continuing to support social injustice in the U.S. and globally, right? So advancing the visibility of the racial injustices that exist within the U.S. And we also had the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. The Me Too movement that started to bring a accountability to sexual harassment and even abuse within the workspace and started to hold people accountable for this. Excuse me. In the March for Our Lives, this nationwide protest in 2018 advocating for gun control, for stricter gun control laws in response to the Parkland shooting, the Parkland school shooting. We also too saw record number of voter turnout in 2020 and 2022 elections. So this reinforcing that Gen Z were taking or stepping into their position of having a voice in this country, with using their vote to essentially to speak towards the issues that were most important to them. And then also to racial injustice protests, right? So worldwide, we were seeing, and this was across every generation. So protests against racial injustice and police brutality. Additionally, in the early 2010s and moving into the early 2020s, we have seen greater access to gender affirming care. So increasing that access to care, information, and support, normalizing the transgender and non-binary identities, making this not only acceptable or tolerated, but really making this part of our community, right? Embracing people who in their full authentic selves, right? By allowing them to be able to step into their identities that they feel most confident and comfortable in. Okay. Now, but we still continue to face these challenges, right? So how are women showing up, the Gen Z women showing up in this space, right? How are they still being challenged and being able to step to really, I think, exist in a space that is continuing to fight against them? You heard me say earlier that the Roe v. Wade overturned, right, stripping the federal abortion rights and redistributing those decisions back to the state. We see that the rise of anti-feminist backlash. So social movements were pushing back on gender equality. So although we may have gained some ground in how it is in trying to close the gender pay gap, we continue to see, especially even today, in 2025, we're seeing policies that are speaking against the rights for women, not only in the workplace, but also too within our country. And so this continues to be a challenge for women across the board. Now, how employers respond to this, that is yet to be seen. Um, economic insecurity. So layoffs are continuing and rising. The rising cost of living is also to making financial independence even harder. Now, while Gen Z may actually be the generation with the lowest amount of debt of any generation, probably next to the boomers, because there wasn't an awful lot of loans and high value loans at that time. Gen X actually has the largest amount of loans, personal loans. Millennials has really high debt due to student loans and for higher education pursuits. But Gen Z, they do not have that. That's not, and that's also to why they feel more empowered to be able to make many of the decisions that they do, right? They do not make it based on, well, there's a heavy responsibility and obligation uh, uh, to continue to, feed their family or support themselves. Many Gen Zers are finding that they have to, out of necessity, to live either at home with their parents or to live in a community, right, where they are essentially part of, renting one place and having, subletting rooms, if you will. So this is common for the generation simply because of the rise or the financial insecurities that they're experiencing, right? The mental health crisis continues while we have greater awareness and we're having the right conversations around what mental health looks like and how that it can be supportive within our country. It's still not enough, right? We need organizations willing to take a stand about how it is that they're going to support their teams and their staff to be to take a mental health day, right? To support them doing the work that is going to support them mentally, right? And I mentioned the burning the candle at both ends. It's being able to step back and say, if the expectation is that there is a 40, 50, 60, 70 hour work week, starting to recognize where we need to reset reality and expectations in that space. And Gen Z is the voice leading that charge. And remember, that will benefit everybody. That conversation will benefit everyone. All right. Gender identity. So political tax and legal restrictions are causing gaps in access to care and mental health, and having a toll on mental health, right? So causing anxiety, depression, and even suicidal ideation, right? So a lot can be done when communities feel supportive and are supportive of one another holistically, even across the genders. Okay, now let's flip this and let's start to make this a little bit, this conversation a bit more uplifting, right? I always like to talk through pop culture and how it's reflective of many of the ongoing, where we are within the gender. What are they experiencing, not the gender, within the generation and what they're experiencing, right? So, some really great films here that I always like to point out, and some television I think that are going to speak towards understanding the generation a little bit more, right? These are movies and television shows that actually are starting to speak to not to just to the Gen Z experience, but really also to the era that they are being shaped in, right? So everybody knows the Hunger Games, right? Rebellion against oppression, which I think very much speaks to the climate within our country. Inside Out is this beautiful film that I love, and there's an Inside Out 2 that starts to really explore the emotions, the mental health and emotions that we feel as humans. And I would welcome you, whether adults or children, watch this film and Inside Out 2 that really starts to bridge the gap between how every emotion is actually felt and why it is that they what is the importance of it. And so one of my favorite animated films to watch that I think starts to really bridge that gap between the acceptance of having conversations and dialogue around mental health. Everybody knows Black Panther. Love this. Continuing to depict and show Black excellence in Hollywood, right? So to start to remove this veil where we have to continue to only be seen in a way that is, our history, our ancestry is speaking to, our community as being only coming from our slave ancestors. That know that there's actually an opportunity for us to understand and peel that onion a bit more to see us in a light that is celebrating Black excellence. And the Joker diving into mental health and the societal alienation, right? So just another film I think really diving into how it is that we need to continue to support one another on a mental space in a mental space. The Woman King, right? So African women warriors fighting colonial oppression. This is a wonderful film. Viola Davis is the lead, and I highly recommend that you start to speak to it's speaking to the oppression of women, although it's specifically about a tribe of African women warriors. It's speaking to the presence and like the evolution, if you will, of how women are being depicted and understood within our society, within our communities. Additionally, Insecure, a television show who has a Black woman lead she's focused on her career and relationships and mental health and exploring this space. Beautifully done. And euphoria. This I got to tell you, it's this is not right for children, but Euphoria is a great show that starts to unveil a bit more understanding many of the complexity around relationships and gender and trauma and power that Gen Z also too experiences. Not all of them, but this starts to give you a line of sight understanding the Gen Z generation just a little bit more and how they might have been experiencing life and walking into adult situations. Okay. All right. I've been talking for a long time. No comments or anything yet. All right. So here's what I want you to understand. Gen Z women are tired of being underestimated. They are tired of being overgoverned, and they're tired of wasting their time to climb or chase a career. They're just not doing it. They're not having it. And you heard me say earlier that they simply do not have to settle for that, right? They're tired of these outdated workplace policies that just don't fit the evolving landscape. It may have been the norm, it may have been what we've come from, but they are completely rejecting it for the future, right? So it's time to start listening and collaborating across these generations. So they are feeling frustrated with this outdated work. They're demanding fair pay uh, and mental health support. They're questioning this corporate ladder, right? Why does it exist? Which has become more of a lattice, and they're doing it. It's not for us to feel. hmm, It's not for us to feel rejected, or they're not just asking questions to be annoyed. They are absolutely pushing back on what we've established as normal within the corporate space and to challenge us to do better, right? So do not take it as a challenge, take it as information as to remember, their perspective has been shaped by experiences that are more confined, more constrained, right? They are at max 28 years old right now. So they've not experienced the life that we have before them. But that doesn't mean that we have to continue to perpetuate the same thing that we've always done for generations. This is how we progress as a society, as a community, right? They are feeling socially disconnected. Remember, they may struggle with some of those in-person communication, which is also too why they don't want to do drinks after work, right? Or go to a I don't know, a department potluck. It's just not, it's not appealing to them. They would rather choose, they do not conflate their work experience with their friends, right? Where in other generations, we would take on our work people as our family, right? They would be our work family and many in many ways our friends. Gen Z don't necessarily subscribe to that ideation, right? They have their friends and then they have the work. The work that they do is it's the exchange of time for money. It's the exchange of a skill of completing a task in order to make a living, but their friendships are usually outside of that. Okay. And that's okay. That's actually called having healthy boundaries. All right. And they also to expect this is not an option. They absolutely expect diversity and inclusion to be standard. And they will ask you those questions when they are assessing you as an employer. Yes, this they understand that it works both ways. And if you do not have a diversity and inclusion as part of your culture, and I don't mean just a checklist, right? Or there's a training that you do on an annual basis. No, they want to see that this is a lived out culture that people experience within the company. Now, now what's next for Gen Z, right? They are going to continue to push you to be better with mental health, fair wages, and collaboration. Period. There's no choice about that. They will not stay, especially in spaces that do not align with their values. They will seek more short-term work, right? Freelancing, maybe just independent gigs or self-employment. Remember, they don't have the high debt that we've had in other generations, so they don't feel obligated to stay any one place. That's not a carrot, and it's certainly not a stick for them. They will lead an AI adoption and fluency. Think about how you might be able to contract with Gen Z to help to bridge this gap. We, in many ways, may feel uh, unprepared, right? To kind of adopt an AI strategy, maybe to start to even pull in new tools and applications. Think about how you might be able to leverage some of these skill sets that are just, second nature. Um, Many generations actually do have this. You'll find people across the generations who have this interest. Gen Z just gets tagged with it simply because it's what they've kind of grown up with, right? But think of how you might be able to approach this. Um, uh, being unprepared by being proactive and bringing someone in to have this conversation, right? To bridge this gap. Gen Z will also too, they will skip the traditional career paths to build their own brand or maybe even their own business, right? They do not feel that the traditional path, right, where it might have been the pathway was always to go from school to higher education to finding your job, right? That now, because of technology, we've been able to now go from one path to thousands of paths, right? There are some who are absolutely bypassing their higher education simply to get into, to do business for themselves. And I've seen this be very successful for them. Gen Z is not constrained by this idea of this concept of the American dream. They or they actually don't even care what anybody thinks of them, which is great and so empowering and and freeing in many ways. They enjoy doing meaningful and purposeful work, purpose-driven work, and will not do so at the sacrifice of their mental sanity. They just won't, right? Those are non-negotiables. So, and in the next 10 years or so, you will see Gen Z actually start to step into leadership roles. Now, this is across many different industries and many different methods of business. And there'll be approximately 5 to 10% of those leadership positions, right? Because think of it, we'll be going from where they are 13 to 28 now to 23 to 38. Okay. So they'll be stepping into those leadership positions, whether we are prepared for them or not. And when they do, they will be carrying the torch of change. At the same time, millennials will be about 50% of those leaders. Combined with the Gen Z, there is change that is already underway, that's already coming. It's time to stop resisting it. All right. So if you're ready to bridge this gap, right, and recognize that we are best walking this bridge of change together, right? You want to be able to leverage your differences across the generations and make them strengths. You want to equip your leaders with strategies that actually work. You want to future-proof your workforce, right? Get a succession plan in place to understand how do you go from today into tomorrow without leaving people behind, without dismissing the experience of those who have traveled decades and built a career of decades. How do we cultivate that knowledge and actually get people collaborating and communicating in a space that is going to be good for everyone? Right? If you want to develop that leadership pipeline, how do you support emerging leaders to step into those positions? Well, it all starts by having a conversation and having a generational strategy, right? So, because this is not a train that is slowing down. It's something that is coming fast and actually is already here. And many of your competitors are actually already doing this. Large organizations across the US have already started to implement and adopt generational strategies that are helping them to take leaps and bounds into the future. So if you're interested in getting together, use the QR code that's on the screen that connects to my calendar, and let's have a conversation about what this looks like for you. Okay, so this month, we've been talking about and celebrating Women's History Month, and this is our conclusion. In that conversation, we've been exploring those key moments in history where women have contributed greatly to the workplace. Now, next month, we're going to start turning the corner because guess what? It's performance review season. People are getting ready to be analyzed, to be reviewed by their leaders, to do self reviews. And guess what? Not every generation is going to be open to how it is that you deliver, that this can be highly anxious time for many people on your team. And I want to give you some tools to help you understand how each generation might be approaching those performance reviews, those conversations. Now, much like corporate parenting, much like how the normal way of doing business, we have many different approaches to how it is that we performance manage our teams. And I want to give you some tools to help you to be able to navigate some of those conversations because you've heard me say before, every generation, right? Boomers maybe want to be checked in once a year and just give them their review. So maybe they're looking forward to this. Gen X wants, a little more frequently, quarterly, get some feedback. Millennials might be like, help me understand and make some timely, course corrections. Gen Z is very, although they may not be heavily or recipient, or sorry, although they may not really want to have that in-person conversation often, they definitely want timely feedback. They do not want to waste a single moment on doing work that is not going to support the overall objective as well as to support their continued advancement in that space. So join me every Wednesday this month. We're going to be talking about a new perspective and how to approach your performance reviews and performance management across each of the generations. So we'll start that here next Wednesday. Every Wednesday we go live with a new topic around generational dynamics. So if you just either log into my profile, you'll see. Always join. I'm going to be live streaming every Wednesday at the same time. All right. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for enduring this conversation with me, and so much for your attention. I appreciate you. Once again, I'm Christina Green, and it has been an honor to present this material to you today. And I look forward to connecting with you. Until the next time, take care.